Hi everyone, my name is Marian and welcome to my very first episode of this knitting podcast. So in these knitting podcasts, I talk about things that I've recently finished, things that I'm currently working on, and maybe things that I'm planning to knit in the future, as well as a little bit about myself. So in this episode, I have 3 finished objects and 2 works in progress. And before we begin, I'd like to ask you all a question. And that is, do you know how to knit? And if you do, who taught you and how did you learn? And if you don't know how to knit, maybe share a hobby that you have and are planning to learn soon. So let me know in the comments below, and I'd love to read all of your responses. And to answer the question myself, I learned how to knit when I was around 13 years old by my teacher in school. And I learned my knit stitches and my purl stitches, and I just made a bunch of swatches and unraveled it and then re-knit those swatches. And eventually I just got a little bit too intimidated to learn how to read a pattern. And so I neglected knitting, I went into sewing, and then I also have a memory of my mom getting me a circular knitting loom as a kid when I was around 7 years old, and I knitted a scarf through that loom. But it wasn't until the beginning of 2024 when I started to earnestly learn how to knit, and I haven't stopped since. So I am fairly new in knitting, but I'm very passionate about this craft, and so I'm just very excited to share everything that I have for you. So before we move on to the finished objects, I'm just going to acknowledge what I'm wearing today. And this is Camisole number 10 by My Favorite Things Knitwear. I cast it on for a size extra small, and then I continued to increase to a small and pretty much follow the pattern to a size small, but I did make modifications. I used a 4mm needle for the body as well as my knit stitches when working flat. And then when I knitted my purl stitches, I used a 3.5mm needle just because my rowing out was pretty obvious with this plant-based fiber. I used Hobbii Friends Cotton Silk DK, just 1 strand only. And then I knitted my armholes a little bit shorter. The original pattern goes pretty far down, but mine did end up being a little bit too short, but it's okay. When it came to the hem of the garment, at first I followed the rolled hem, but I found that it took away 1 inch of the length, which I wasn't really liking so much. I didn't mind it, but I just didn't feel very classy with like my belly button constantly sticking out. And so I undid the bind off. I added 1 row of purls, and then I did about 3 rows of stockinette stitch before I bind it off with a standard bind off. And I just use the same needle size for that as well. So in terms of the yarn, this yarn is pretty cool to work with. I really like the cotton and the silk blend. It does have like a more worn look, but I think I don't really mind it. It looks pretty natural to me. And the purling did cause me hand soreness when I was purling. I normally don't mind purls, but I think as I have knitted for a while, I'm starting to kind of realize why people don't like purling so much. And it's just because it hurts. Other than that, I did actually put this garment into the washing machine. I put it in a net bag just to see what would kind of happen, and it did shed a lot, but I'm kind of glad that it did that because now it's not really shedding as much anymore. So I wouldn't really do that again, but I'm just saying that I did do it. So anyways, if I were to knit this again, I would probably knit a size medium just so that I could have a little bit more room. And I would probably do 2 repeats longer for the armhole just to give myself some space when I put the top on. Otherwise, I have all of my notes on my Ravelry. I have 458 views on my project page. That's pretty pretty interesting. So that is my camisole number 10 by My Favorite Things Knitwear. So next on the list are my finished objects from the month of April. I don't have anything for May yet, so I thought that I would share April. For me, April was a month of casting on as well as recovery. And so most of the pieces I made are fairly small, but they, I think, are pretty mighty. So first is my emotional support chicken. So this is Esther Polly, my emotional support chicken. Esther Polly is the not so polyester chicken, and she was born on the evening of Easter Sunday. I was inspired to knit her after watching Alana's video, and Alana is the owner of Lupine Wool Co. in New Zealand, and she also has a YouTube channel called Black Cat Knit Co. She's also a designer, and she has a video of her and her husband going to the Knitting Tree LA where the emotional support chicken was born. This is a pattern designed by Annette Corsino, but I believe it was adapted from a vintage pattern. So in the video, she speaks to one of the ladies that works at the Knitting Tree LA, and she shares the history and like the power of these chickens. And so that is really cool. I was just really inspired to knit myself a chicken. So Esther Polly was knitted with Hobbii Winter Glow, and for the main color it is the shade 03, and then the striping is in the shade Oat in the solid color range. I held the Winter Glow double to meet a worsted weight gauge, and then I also purchased the Fern sock wool by Hobbii in the shade Bordeaux and Gold Dust for her beak and comb. I did opt out of whatever this part was, but I did knit it. I didn't attach it. And so she is stuffed with polyfill, and that is her. She is knitted with 5 separate pieces, and so each side of the tail is knitted separately, and then you seam it right here, and then you pick up stitches along the tail, and then it's pretty much knitted flat to the beak. And then there is this part, which is the belly. And so the belly is knitted flat, and then when you seam it, you're basically seaming all the way down from her beak to her belly and then up to her tail. So it does take some time. It's a quick project, but it's an engaging quick project. So it's definitely not a mindless knit. Although, to be honest, I don't really enjoy mindless knitting, so this one worked pretty well for me. Another thing is that the Winter Glow is 50-50 polyester and, acrylic and wool. So it was a pretty cool experience having the 50% wool in there. It doesn't really feel like a 100% acrylic, so that was pretty nice on the hand. Anyways, I highly recommend knitting an emotional support chicken. Esther Polly brings me so much joy, and I love just hugging her. She's so cute. So, thank you, Esther Polly. So in April, I also finished these vanilla socks that I cranked mostly on my circular sock knitting machine. And my circular sock knitting machine is 3D printed by my brother, so thank you. And then my husband assembled it, which was a huge task, so thank you so much to him as well. I'm now able to make vanilla socks very quickly because of that. And I used a 54 stitch cylinder, so that is the circumference of my sock. So the gauge is equivalent to a 2.75 millimeter needle, so it is a little bit looser than like a hand knit sock, but it doesn't really bother me. The main color is Knit Picks in their Stroll base, and that is a 75-25 merino nylon blend. And this one is their Tweed Dill Heather. The red is the same yarn that I used for Esther Polly's comb, and that is Fern sock wool in red, or sorry, Bordeaux. And I will say that I got a faulty skein of the red. Unfortunately, it was spun inconsistently, and so it was a little thin and a little thick, so it does make your stitches look a bit weird. But after wearing and blocking and washing, it is just unnoticeable, and it's not something that I really care for anymore. In terms of the specs, I did 15 rows of a stockinette rolled cuff. My heel is 6 rows of stockinette before I decrease, and then for my toe I do 8 rows of stockinette before I decrease. My foot is 54 rows in the main yarn, and then my leg is 35 rows. And the length of my sock is pretty much dependent on the amount of yarn that I have. And so this was pretty much like 33 grams of the Dill Heather, and so that is just as much as I cranked. And so I call these my Froggy Christmas socks because I used that green color in another pair of socks that I made that was inspired by Frog and Toad. And so why not just keep it in theme and just call it my Froggy Christmas socks. So say hello to my vest number 8 by My Favorite Things Knitwear. So I completed this back in February, but it wasn't until April when I completely blocked it and sewed in the buttons. And it was taking me a while to find the buttons for this vest, but as I was shopping at Michael's for Esther's safety eyes, the buttons were thankfully in the same section as the eyes, so I just grabbed these buttons from Michael's. So the yarn that I used was Brushtale Upcycled Merino Possum 4-ply, which is actually a 2-ply 4-ply. I picked this up during my honeymoon in New Zealand. I was in Rotorua when I purchased this yarn, and the shade that I'm using is in Shale. So this yarn is just very luxurious, it's beautiful, it's soft, and it is also upcycled from garment offcuts that was respun into yarn. It's also 100% fully sourced and processed in New Zealand, which is actually pretty rare because a lot of their wool gets exported out of the country to get manufactured. I held this with a mohair as well, and the mohair that I used is Knit Picks Aloft in the shade Carbon, and this mohair is very soft. I highly recommend it. It is a much more affordable alternative to the Izager kid silk mohair, so if you are in the United States, I highly recommend the Knit Picks Aloft mohair. So I knitted a size extra small, but with my gauge and my blocking, it ended up fitting more like the size small, which is actually what I wanted. I did go down a needle size to a 3.75 millimeter needle just to add more density to the fabric. So something that I've noticed in the pattern projects of this vest is that it tends to flare a lot in the bottom, and so mine does flare a little bit, more so in the front than the back. And so right here on the sides, on these 3 cables right here, I knitted 2 together on each end of the cable. So in total, I decreased 12 stitches. So 6 over here, and then another 6 on this side. And so that just kind of helped take about, it probably took about 2 inches worth of flaring. So I could have done a little bit more, but I just wasn't too sure. I didn't want it to be too cinched in at the base. I must say though that this wasn't my most enjoyable knit. These cables just kind of gave me a little bit of fatigue, and I just got kind of tired knitting these cables over and over again. So I'm kind of glad that this is just a vest, because I probably wouldn't have been able to finish this with those sleeves. And then another thing is that I made a really big mistake. And so it wasn't something that I noticed until I was picking up stitches for the neckline and the button band, that I noticed I did a full cable repeat longer on this shoulder. And so it was a full inch longer, and so I grafted it. And when I grafted it, it actually turned out okay. It wasn't great, but I got a little too confident and I wanted to graft it again. And that was a very bad decision, because basically I couldn't find my stitches anymore. I didn't know where they went. And so I picked up as much stitches as I could find, and then I did a 3 needle bind off. And so far it's okay. This is like kind of what the back looks like. But you know, I don't really think it's like the most noticeable thing, unless of course you're a knitter. But it kind of just blends in with the cables and the mohair and the heathering that is going on. But besides that, I do embrace the mistakes and the mess that it is, and I think the finished object is pretty good. So moving on to my works in progress, these are my honeycomb and moss socks. This is a pattern by Summer Lee in her book called The Sock Project. And I am knitting these on 2.25 millimeter needles with 9-inch circulars. With the exception of the heel I used a 2 millimeter needle, just because I don't have DPNs in a 2.25, and I thought that it would be better to have a tighter and more robust heel than a loose one. I am using the same yarn as Esther's Beak, which is Fern sock wool in the shade Gold Dust. And so far, so good. I'm really liking this pattern. So I was initially knitting the penny socks, which is a free pattern on Hobbii, but I wasn't finding it to be very intuitive. It is like a lace pattern, and I find cables to be a little bit more intuitive for me. And so because this yellow kind of reminded me of like honeycomb and crunchy, I decided that maybe a honeycomb would like make more sense. This yellow also reminds me of like Wes Anderson, and so if I don't have enough yarn for 2, I might end up just framing this and making it kind of like a Wes Anderson moment. So I think that'd be a pretty cool idea. We shall see. So next I have my sweater number 30 v-neck by My Favorite Things Knitwear, which I casted on in April. So I initially wanted to knit the sweater number 23 because I really liked the combination of green yarns that Louise, the designer of My Favorite Things Knitwear, chose for that sweater. It was kind of like this appley green marled heathering that's going on, and I just really liked it because I was also getting targeted on Pinterest for this Camilla sweater by Saks Potts in a green apple color as well. So I really wanted to make this very large, cozy, oversized, dense sweater, but because I had this sweater's quantity of this forest green yarn, I really just needed to work with what I had. And so by the force of nature, I ended up in this boutique and I found this dark forest green mossy sweater that was marled with like forest green and brown yarns. And so it was also a v-neck, so I was kind of just really hooked by that one. So as time passed and as Louise released sweater number 30, I went for a saddle shoulder construction instead. So the mohair that I'm using is Friend's Kid Silk in the shade Americano, and this has 3% of wool in it, which possibly is the reason why it feels a little bit more prickly than other mohairs that I've used. I'm also using Harrisville Designs in their Shetland base in the shade Hemlock. And this yarn is very beautiful. It's exactly what I was looking for, and it's sourced from Australia and New Zealand wool. So that really connected back with my ethos, because the sweater's quantity that I had in that forest green yarn is by Wild Earth Yarns, which is also a 100% grown and processed yarn company in New Zealand. And so I really just wanted to tie those values in together. This is what I consider a dream knit. So I'm just so excited to have this in my closet soon. When it came to knitting this, I wanted a denser gauge, and so I went down a needle size and used a 4.5mm needle when I was working flat. And I didn't think that my rowing out was going to be that bad, but it turns out that it was actually pretty bad. My purls are a full 2mm larger than my knit stitches. And so as I joined in the round with the 4.5s, it got really tight. And so I changed to a 5mm and did about 3 rows of that. And then I measured my gauge, and I was 2 stitches tighter than the flat parts of the sweater. And so I went up to a 5.5mm for the rest of the body. And then I pretty much did the exact same thing for the sleeves. So when working flat for the short rows, I used a 4.5, and then I gradually made my way up to a 5.5, just because that millimeter difference is kind of a little bit tight on the needle. I also wanted the saddle shoulder to look like it was flowing into the sleeve nicely. So in terms of the ribbing for the neck, the cuff, and the hem, I just followed the needle sizes that Louise recommended in the pattern. And for all of my ribbing, I did a short row turn, including the neckline, just for a neater ribbing. And I'm so glad I did that, because it really does pay off in the end. It's a very easy and simple thing. You just do a German short row turn, and there are a lot of German short rows in this pattern. So you're definitely going to learn how to do that. In fact, this is actually my very first project where I used German short rows. Just kidding, it's my second. But I definitely got used to the idea of German short rows in this pattern. So the other modification that I did was that for the decreasing for the sleeves, I changed my rate after the 11th decrease round. And so what I did was that I decreased every 3rd row instead, because the sleeve was getting a little bit too long for me, and I am a short person. I'm 5'2" 3/4", and so I definitely needed shorter sleeves. So yeah, I'm almost done knitting this sweater. I am calling it my return to the Shire, because I'm moving to New Zealand in July, and so I'm really hoping to just stay extra cozy and warm in this sweater as I'm moving in the middle of winter. So as you could tell, I have knitted my heart out. So this is a free pattern on knitty.com. It is designed by Kristen Leggett, and it's a very fiddly pattern, but it's very fun. I knitted this one with Fern sock wool in Bordeaux, and I also used Knit Picks Stroll in Cranberry Heather for the bottom body of the heart. I did like 2-stranded color work just so that it could kind of look like it was fading upwards, and it is knitted bottom up, so it looks like this when it's undone. Mine is knotted a little bit differently just because I knitted this part much longer than it's kind of like supposed to be. I did follow the pattern, but I think just due to my gauge, this doesn't look as proportionate to the rest of the heart, and so I do knot it like this. So yeah, it's very fiddly. I didn't exactly have the right tools for this project, but I just did what I could do. I did make some mistakes, but it's not really noticeable, and I just embroidered over some parts and I sewed some parts shut, but I still have a lot of holes and stretched out parts of the heart. But yeah, I think it's really cool, and I think it would look really good like on a bookshelf or something like that, just as a nice little artsy piece. And so maybe whenever you have visitors, they could like kind of, I don't know, pick it up and squish it a little bit. So yeah, that is really cool. It also makes a really good gift. So that is all for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me in my very first episode of this knitting podcast. Also, let me know if there's anything that I can improve on in this video. I'd like to implement those in the future. I know my mic is probably not the best, so that's something that I'm looking to explore as I kind of go on with these videos. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining me, and happy knitting!